Why would a powerful millionaire stop his limousine for this one boy? What did he see in this child's tears that reminded him of a painful secret he had buried for 40 years? The story begins not with an act of kindness, but with a memory. The park bench was Leo's sanctuary. To the joggers who pounded past, and the mothers pushing strollers, he was just another fixture of the urban landscape, a quiet, 10-year-old black boy in clothes that had seen better days. But in his own world, seated on the weathered green slats of that bench, he was a king in his castle, a sorcerer conjuring worlds from nothing. His wand was a stubby graphite pencil, and his spellbook was a worn, spiral-bound sketchbook that he protected as if it were made of solid gold. He was lost in that world now, his brow furrowed in concentration. His pencil flew across the page, not with the hesitant strokes of a child, but with a confident, knowing grace that belied his years. He wasn't just drawing the ancient oak tree in front of him. He was capturing its soul, the gnarled texture of its bark, the weary sag of its oldest branches, the way the late afternoon sun dappled through its leaves like liquid gold. He could spend hours like this, translating the silent language of the world into lines and shadows, the quiet hum of the city, a distant, irrelevant soundtrack. His own appearance was a stark contrast to the beauty he created. His t-shirt was faded, his jeans frayed at the knees, but it was his shoes that told the most honest story. They were a pair of old generic sneakers, once black but now a dusty gray. The rubber soles were peeling away from the canvas in a grin of defeat, and his big toe peeked through a hole on the right shoe. They were the shoes of a boy who walked everywhere, who ran and played and lived his life fully, but who could not outrun the quiet grip of poverty. He was acutely aware of them, often tucking his feet under the bench, hoping to render them, and the story they told, invisible. His concentration was shattered by a sound that was sharp and unwelcome. Laughter. Not the joyful, uninhibited laughter of children playing, but the cruel, pointed kind that seeks a target. "Look at those shoes!" a voice chirped, dripping with condescension. Leo flinched, his pencil freezing mid-stroke. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. Caleb and Sophia. They were twins, dressed in matching navy blazers and khaki pants from the prestigious prep school on the other side of the park. They considered this park their personal kingdom, and Leo, an unwelcome peasant. He kept his head down, his heart starting to beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He hoped if he stayed still enough, he would become part of the bench, invisible. "I think they're talking to us," Sophia said, her voice a high-pitched giggle. "They're so worn out. Their mouths are wide open." Caleb let out a loud, braying laugh. "Yeah, what are they trying to say? Please, sir, can I have some new shoes?" The words were like stones, and Leo felt each one hit. The shame was a hot, prickling sensation that crawled up his neck and burned his cheeks. He slowly closed his sketchbook, the world he had been creating now feeling fragile and foolish. He curled his toes, trying to hide the hole in his shoe, a futile gesture that only made him more aware of it. Miles away in spirit, but only a few yards away in reality, Alistair Finch was at war. He sat in the back of his black stretch limousine, the plush leather, a silent, indifferent witness to his frustration. The air was chilled to a precise 68 degrees, a stark contrast to the warm, golden light of the afternoon outside. "No, you listen to me, Henderson," he barked into his phone, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I don't care about their projections. I built this company on facts, not fantasies. If the numbers don't add up by Friday, the deal is dead. Do you understand me?" He was in his element, a world of leverage, of calculated risks, of decisive, brutal efficiency. But today, his focus was fractured. The limo, usually a bubble of silent, forward momentum, was stuck. He glanced impatiently out the tinted window. A minor fender bender up ahead had stalled traffic, and his driver was waiting for an opening. Alistair let out an exasperated sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. He hated being stationary. He hated being idle. It was in these moments of forced stillness that the ghosts of his past tended to whisper the loudest. He looked out the window again, his gaze sweeping dismissively over the mundane scene of the park. Children playing, parents chatting. And then, his eyes locked onto a small, painfully familiar drama unfolding on a park bench. He saw a young boy, head bowed in shame. He saw two well-dressed children standing over him, their bodies angled in the universal posture of bullies. He saw them pointing, their mouths open in cruel laughter. And then he saw the shoes. The world tilted on its axis. The voice of his CFO on the phone became a distant, buzzing insect. The multi-million-dollar deal became insignificant dust. All Alistair could see were those tattered, broken sneakers, with a hole in the right toe. Instantly, the polished interior of the limousine dissolved, replaced by the cracked, muddy asphalt of a schoolyard 45 years ago. He was 10 years old again, a small, skinny kid with patched-up trousers and a fierce, desperate pride. He was surrounded by a circle of laughing faces, their taunts echoing in his ears. Look at Finch's shoes. His toes are saying hello. He could still feel the searing, helpless shame, the burning in his eyes as he fought back tears, the cold, hard knot of rage that formed in his stomach. It was that knot of rage that had fueled him his entire life. It was the engine that had driven him from the slums to the boardroom, the vow he had made to that weeping 10-year-old boy. Never again. You will never be weak again. You will own the world so that no one can ever make you feel small. Sir? Mr. Finch? Are you there? Henderson's voice crackled through the phone. Alistair blinked, the schoolyard fading, the limousine reforming around him. But the feeling, the ghost of that shame was still there, as real and as raw as it had been decades ago. He looked back at the boy on the bench, seeing not a stranger, but a mirror. "I'll call you back," Alistair said, his voice strangely calm. He ended the call without waiting for a reply. He leaned forward, his voice sharp and clear. "Stop the car, Frank." The driver looked back, confused. "But sir, the traffic is about to—" "Now," Alistair commanded. The car glided to a halt. Alistair's face, moments ago a mask of corporate stress, had transformed. It was now a cold, granite-hard expression of a fury that had been dormant for decades. He opened the door and stepped out of the air-conditioned quiet into the warm, sunlit afternoon. He didn't just step out. He emerged, a predator scenting a threat to his own wounded young. His world had a new, singular focus. The deal could wait. The world could wait. The ghosts of the past were calling. And for the first time in his life, Alistair Finch was going back to answer. Each step Alistair took on the paved park path was a step back in time. The expensive, hand-stitched leather of his Oxford shoes felt alien, a costume worn over the ghost memory of thin, cardboard-patched soles. The world around him seemed to narrow, the cheerful sounds of the park fading into a muted hum. All he could hear was the echo of taunts from a dusty schoolyard 45 years ago. All he could feel was the phantom sting of shame. He wasn't walking towards two children and a stranger. He was walking towards a version of himself he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. He observed the scene with the predatory focus of a master negotiator, sizing up an opponent. The two children, Caleb and Sophia, were so engrossed in their cruel sport that they didn't notice his approach. They were drunk on their own perceived superiority, their laughter sharp and careless. They saw a boy with torn shoes. Alistair saw something far more sinister. The casual, unthinking cruelty of privilege. The same lazy arrogance he battled every day in boardrooms, just in a smaller, more unfiltered form. Leo, the boy on the bench, was completely folded in on himself. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed so low that his chin nearly touched his chest. He had made himself as small as possible, a tactic of self-preservation that Alistair recognized with a fresh wave of anger. The boy wasn't just being teased. A part of his spirit was being systematically dismantled, his worth being defined by a pair of worn-out sneakers. Alistair didn't storm in. He didn't shout. Shouting was for those who had lost control. His power lay in a cold, deliberate calm that unnerved even the most seasoned corporate raiders. He stopped directly behind Caleb and Sophia, his large frame casting a sudden, imposing shadow over them. The laughter died in their throats. The change was instantaneous. One moment, they were the predators. The next, They felt the unnerving presence of something much larger and more dangerous. They turned slowly, their smug expressions faltering as they looked up and up at the stern, unsmiling face of the man who had appeared from nowhere. Alistair ignored them for a moment. His gaze was fixed on Leo, on the sketchbook clutched in the boy's lap. Then, he let his eyes travel down to the boy's shoes, the very objects of ridicule. He stared at them, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked back at the two children. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the afternoon air with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Those are very nice shoes you're wearing," he said, his eyes flicking down to their immaculate loafers. Caleb and Sophia exchanged a confused glance. This was not the reaction they expected. "Thank you, sir," Caleb stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Tell me," Alistair continued, his tone dangerously soft, "do they have any stories?" The question hung in the air, baffling and strange. "Stories?" Sophia repeated, her voice a small squeak. "Yes, stories," Alistair affirmed, taking a half-step closer. His presence was overwhelming. "Because the shoes that young man is wearing," he said, nodding towards Leo without taking his eyes off them. "They are telling a story, a very important one. They tell the story of every street he has walked down, every errand he has run for his family. They tell the story of every game he has played, of every time he has chased a ball or a dream. Each scuff, each tear, is a sentence in the story of his life. They are a badge of a life being lived, not just observed." He let the words sink in, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. "Now, I look at your shoes," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "They are clean, they are perfect, they are expensive, but they are silent. They tell me nothing about you, except what your parents can afford. They have no character, no story." He paused, letting them squirm in the uncomfortable silence. "You are laughing at his story," he concluded, his voice laced with ice, "which tells me you don't have one of your own worth telling." It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened them. He had simply taken their weapon privilege and turned it against them, exposing it not as a source of strength, but as a sign of emptiness. He had reframed the boy's poverty not as a weakness, but as a mark of authenticity, of a life rich with experience. Caleb and Sophia were completely disarmed. Shame, a foreign and unpleasant emotion, began to creep into their faces. They looked at Leo, then back at their own pristine shoes, and for the first time, they seemed to understand. We're sorry," Sophia mumbled, looking at the ground. "We were just joking," Caleb added weakly. "Some jokes leave scars," Alistair said, his voice final. "Now go, find a story of your own to live." Without another word, the two children turned and practically fled, their retreat as swift and undignified as their earlier attack had been arrogant. The space they left behind was filled with a heavy silence. Alistair stood for a moment, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly receding, leaving behind the familiar ache of old wounds. He turned his attention to Leo, who had not moved, his face still hidden. The anger in Alistair's expression melted away, replaced by a deep, resonant empathy. He walked to the bench and sat down, not too close, leaving a respectful distance between them. He didn't speak immediately. He just sat there, sharing the silence, letting the boy know he wasn't alone. He remembered his own experience after being bullied. The well-meaning adults had always rushed in with platitudes. "Don't listen to them. Sticks and stones may break my bones." But none of them had ever just sat with him in his shame. None of them had validated his pain by simply being present. "You don't have to be ashamed," Alistair said finally, his voice now gentle, stripped of all its earlier hardness. "What you have," he nodded towards the worn-out shoes, "is proof that you're a survivor. It's nothing to be ashamed of." Leo still didn't look up, but his shoulders relaxed a fraction. "Courage isn't about the shoes you wear," Alistair continued, speaking as much to the 10-year-old boy beside him as to the 10-year-old boy within himself. "It's about the places you're willing to walk to. And from what I can see, You've been walking a very long way." He let the silence settle again, a comfortable, shared quiet. He was about to stand up and leave, his duty done, when his eyes fell upon the sketchbook resting on Leo's lap. He had almost forgotten about it. He saw the corner of a beautifully rendered drawing of an oak leaf peeking out from under the boy's hand. And in that moment, the encounter shifted. It was no longer just about the past. It was about to become about the future. The confrontation was over. The bully's gone. But the air around the bench still felt charged with unspoken emotions. Alistair, having addressed the ghosts of his own past, now found himself looking at the boy beside him not just as a reflection, but as an individual. His gaze was drawn to the sketchbook, held tightly in Leo's small hands. It was the only object the boy seemed to possess that wasn't worn or faded. It was cared for, protected. "You're a talented artist," Alistair said, his tone shifting from that of a protector to one of genuine curiosity. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Leo finally stirred. He risked a sideways glance at the imposing man beside him, a flicker of surprise in his tear-filled eyes. No one had ever called him that before. To his teachers, he was the quiet kid in the back. To his grandmother, he was her sweet, helpful boy. But an artist? That felt like a title from another world. "May I?" Alistair asked, gesturing towards the book. His voice was laced with a respect that was entirely new to Leo. People in his life were either kind out of pity or dismissive out of prejudice. This was different. This was the respect one gives to a peer. Leo hesitated for only a second before giving a small, shy nod. He held out the sketchbook. Alistair took it gently, his large, powerful hands handling the flimsy cardboard cover with surprising delicacy. He opened it to the first page, and the world fell away. Alistair Finch was a man who lived surrounded by art. His penthouse walls were adorned with masterpieces, Picassos, Monets, Rothkos. He understood the value of art as an investment, as a symbol of status. But what he saw in this child's cheap sketchbook was something he hadn't encountered in any gallery. It was raw, unfiltered truth. The pages were filled with the world of the park, but seen through Leo's uniquely perceptive eyes. There was a portrait of an elderly woman feeding pigeons, each wrinkle on her face a roadmap of her life. There was a sketch of a dog chasing a frisbee, its muscles coiled in a perfect explosion of joyful energy. He had captured the way light filtered through the leaves, the subtle melancholy of a wilting flower, the tired slump of a man reading a newspaper on a bench. Leo didn't just draw what he saw. He drew what he felt. There was a profound empathy in every line, a quiet understanding of the beauty and sorrow of the world. Alistair turned the pages slowly, completely captivated. He had spent his life dealing with people who hid behind masks of sophistication and power. This boy, with nothing but a pencil and a keen eye, saw straight through to the soul of things. Then, Alistair stopped. He had reached a page in the middle of the book that held a single, stark drawing. It was a still life, a self-portrait, of a kind. It was a hyper-detailed, heart-wrenchingly honest depiction of his own torn shoes. Leo had drawn them not with shame, but with an artist's detached intimacy, capturing every frayed lace, every peeling seam, every scar and stain that told their story. Alistair stared at the drawing, a lump forming in his throat. This boy hadn't just drawn a pair of shoes. He had drawn a symbol of his struggle, and, in doing so, had given it a strange and powerful dignity. A sad, knowing smile touched Alistair's lips. "You see things very clearly, Leo," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "You know, a long time ago, I had a pair of shoes just like these." Leo finally looked up, his full attention captured. The wall of shame that had surrounded him began to crumble. Alistair looked out over the park, but his eyes were seeing a different time, a different place. "I wore them every day for 2 years," he began, his voice taking on a distant, narrative quality. "They had a hole in the right toe, just like yours. The other kids at school, they were a lot like your 2 friends here. They thought it was the funniest thing in the world." He paused, the memory still sharp enough to sting. "I used to hate those shoes," he confessed, speaking more to himself than to the boy. I hated them so much. I promised myself that one day I would be so rich, I would never have to wear anything that was old or broken ever again. I would have 100 pairs of shoes, 1,000. And that's what I did. He looked down at his own expensive, polished Oxfords. I worked. I fought. I clawed my way to the top. All because I never wanted to be that little boy with the hole in his shoe again. He turned to Leo, and his eyes were filled with a profound, raw honesty. But you know a secret? Sometimes, when I'm in my big, empty house, surrounded by all my new, perfect things, I miss those old shoes. Because they were real. They knew who I was. They knew where I came from. In that moment, the vast chasm between the billionaire and the poor boy vanished. They were no longer defined by their clothes or their bank accounts. They were just two people, one old and one young, who understood the quiet, private pain of being judged for what you lack, rather than for what you possess. Your talent? Alistair said, his voice now firm, filled with a new purpose, is too important to be hidden or held back by a pair of shoes. It deserves to be seen. It deserves a chance. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a slim, elegant wallet. From it he produced a heavy, cream-colored business card. On it, in stark black letters, were the words, Alistair Finch, CEO, Harrison Global. He handed the card to Leo. Give this to your grandmother, he said. Tell her that Mr. Finch would like to speak with her. Tell her that I believe I've just discovered the most promising young artist in the city, and I would like to make an investment in his future. Leo stared at the card, then up at the man's face, his eyes wide with a dawning, electrifying hope. A single tear, the last remnant of his earlier sorrow, escaped and traced a path down his cheek. But this time, it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release, of being seen, truly and completely. For the very first time, the walk back to the limousine was an entirely different journey from the one Alistair had taken just minutes before. He was no longer a vengeful ghost, striding back to a painful past. He was a man leading a young artist toward a promising future. He had invited Leo to ride with him, a gesture that was part practical and part symbolic. As Leo slid onto the plush leather seat, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief, Alistair felt a sense of rightness he hadn't experienced in years. The interior of the car, which had felt like a cold, sterile cage on the way here, now seemed like a vessel of possibility. The usual silence between destinations was filled with a quiet, hesitant conversation. Alistair didn't ask about the bullies or about Leo's poverty. He asked about the sketchbook. That drawing of the dog, Alistair began. The way you captured the muscles in its legs. How did you learn to do that? For the first time, Leo spoke about his passion. He talked about how he would watch animals for hours, studying how they moved. He talked about light and shadow, about how the same tree could look happy in the morning and sad in the evening. As he spoke, the shy, withdrawn boy from the park bench began to recede, replaced by an articulate and passionate young artist. Alistair listened, not with the detached interest of a patron, but with the focused attention of a man discovering a rare and precious resource. He was a deal maker, and he knew, with every fiber of his being, that this was the best investment he would ever make. The limousine glided from the manicured avenues of the city's wealthy district into the humbler, grittier streets of Leo's neighborhood. It was a world of brick tenements and bustling corner stores, a world Alistair had once known intimately but had long since left behind. The car, a sleek black symbol of immense wealth, looked entirely out of place, drawing curious stares from passers-by. They pulled up in front of a modest, well-kept apartment building. Alistair accompanied Leo to the door of his third-floor apartment. It was opened by a woman in her late 60s, her face etched with the lines of a hard life, but her eyes sharp and intelligent. This was Leo's grandmother, Evelyn. She looked from her grandson's flushed, excited face to the impossibly well-dressed man standing beside him, her expression a mixture of confusion and fierce protectiveness. "Leo, what is this?" she asked, her voice wary. "Grandma, this is Mr. Finch," Leo said, his voice filled with a reverence that made Alistair feel both humbled and deeply responsible. He liked my drawings. Alistair extended a hand. Ma'am, it is an honor to meet you, he said, his tone stripped of all corporate artifice. He treated her not as an obstacle, but with the profound respect he would have shown a queen. Your grandson is an extraordinary talent. I am not exaggerating when I say he has a gift I have rarely seen. He spent the next hour in their small, tidy living room, a space filled with worn but well-loved furniture. He explained what he had witnessed in the park, choosing his words carefully to spare Leo any further embarrassment. He then laid out his proposal. He spoke not of charity, but of a partnership. He wanted to become Leo's patron, to provide him with the resources he needed to nurture his gift. The best art supplies, private lessons with a renowned local artist, and a dedicated fund that would one day pay for his university education. Evelyn listened, her arms crossed, her gaze never leaving Alistair's face. She was a woman who had seen her share of false promises. She was weighing not just his words, but the character of the man speaking them. Alistair understood. He didn't rush her. He answered her sharp questions with honesty and patience. He was not a billionaire trying to buy a new project. He was a man trying to right a past wrong, trying to give this boy the chance he himself had never had. Finally, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. Leo is a good boy, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He deserves a chance. If you are true to your word, Mr. Finch, then we will accept your help. With gratitude. That day marked the beginning of a profound shift. True to his word, Alistair provided everything he had promised, and more. The next Saturday, a delivery arrived at Leo's apartment. A magnificent wooden easel, professional-grade canvases, and a dizzying array of paints, charcoals, and pastels that made Leo's eyes shine with a joy so pure it was breathtaking. Alistair arranged for Leo to study with a celebrated artist named Julian Croft, a man known for his reclusive nature and his refusal to take on students. Alistair had simply sent Julian the sketchbook. An hour later, Julian had called back, saying only, "Send me the boy." But Alistair's involvement went far beyond financial support. He became a fixture in Leo's life. At least once a week, the black limousine would appear on Leo's street. Sometimes, Alistair would take him to museums, where they would stand in front of masterpieces for hours, discussing technique and composition as equals. Other times, they would simply return to that same park bench, not as a site of trauma, but as their own private studio, both of them sketching in comfortable silence. During these visits, Alistair began to change. The hard, cynical shell he had worn for decades began to crack. He found himself laughing, a real, genuine laugh, at Leo's quiet jokes. He started noticing the world again, not as a series of assets and liabilities, but through the boy's artistic eyes. He saw the beauty in the rust on a fire escape, the grace in the flight of a city pigeon. The boy he had intended to save was, in turn, saving him from the gilded prison of his own making. He was rediscovering the boy he had once been, the boy who loved to draw, the boy who saw stories everywhere, the boy who existed long before the rage and the ambition had taken over. He was healing. 5 years passed, not as a fleeting moment, but as a period of profound and steady growth, like a tree sinking its roots deep into fertile ground. The city changed, seasons turned, but the bond between the aging tycoon and the young artist only strengthened. The scene was now a world away from the sun-drenched park bench. It was a prestigious, brightly lit art gallery in the heart of the city's gallery district. A sophisticated crowd moved through the space, their hushed conversations, a mix of critical analysis and appreciative murmurs. It was the opening night of the annual New Voices exhibition, an event that could launch a young artist's career. And tonight, the most celebrated new voice belonged to a 15-year-old named Leo. He stood beside his centerpiece, a large canvas that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. He was no longer the small, timid boy who hid his feet under a bench. He was a tall, confident young man, dressed in a simple but well-fitting suit, his eyes bright with a quiet, self-assured energy. He spoke articulately to critics and patrons, explaining his technique and vision with a maturity that belied his age. The painting itself was a masterpiece of emotional storytelling. It depicted a young boy sitting on a park bench, bathed in a warm, golden light. But unlike the memory that had inspired it, this boy was not hunched in shame. His head was held high, his gaze fixed on a distant, hopeful horizon, a sketchbook open on his lap. It was a portrait of resilience, of dignity found in the face of hardship. It was titled, simply, The Storyteller. Across the room, standing quietly in the background, was Alistair Finch. He watched Leo with an expression that no one on his corporate board would have recognized. The cold, calculating mask of the CEO was gone, replaced by the raw, undisguised pride of a father. A genuine, unforced smile played on his lips. His own empire, his billions, his skyscrapers, they all felt like distant, abstract achievements compared to the tangible, magnificent reality of the young man standing before him. This, he knew, was his true legacy. Later in the evening, after the main rush of the crowd had subsided, Leo made his way over to Alistair. "Well," Alistair said, his voice warm, "it seems your stories are finding quite an audience." "Our stories," Leo corrected him gently, with a smile. "I couldn't have told them without you." Alistair's gaze drifted down to Leo's feet. He was wearing a pair of elegant, handcrafted leather shoes, a gift from Alistair for the opening night. "Those are a long way from the ones you used to wear," Alistair remarked. Leo looked down at his shoes, then back up at Alistair, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, they are," he agreed, "but I still have the old pair. I keep them in my studio, right next to my first easel." Alistair looked at him, intrigued. "Why?" "To remind me," Leo said, his voice clear and steady. "To remind me that a person's worth is never measured by what they wear on their feet, but by the path they choose to walk. And to remind me that sometimes, when you're at your lowest, a stranger can come along and show you a new path you never knew existed." Alistair felt a familiar lump form in his throat. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture of profound affection and gratitude. In that moment, he realized the full truth of his journey. On that day in the park, Alistair Finch thought he was rescuing a young boy from the casual cruelty of the world. But in truth, he was rescuing himself from the cold, lonely fortress he had built around his own heart. He learned that the greatest deals are not closed in boardrooms, and the most valuable assets are not listed on the stock exchange. He discovered that the truest measure of a man's wealth is not the ability to buy anything he wants, but the wisdom to invest in someone's potential. A pair of torn shoes, once a symbol of shame, had become a catalyst for healing, forging an unbreakable bond, and reminding them both that the most beautiful stories often begin on the humblest of pages.